Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Midweek in the City 2021. A brand new year. Feels oddly familiar so far, but that is an aside. I'm glad that you are here to join us. And again, as always, joining us is Megan Langen, our wonderful associate minister for single adults. And we've got a really, I think, intriguing conversation lined up for this evening with Wendy Holbrook, who is the executive director of Interfaith San Antonio Alliance and, most recently, pastor in residence at Laurel Heights United Methodist Church. And we are here to jump into a conversation about unity and about being able to cultivate the ability to talk to one another across differing opinion, political dividing lines, et cetera, et cetera. So we will get there in just a moment. But before then, I want to say that we will be up and running with Midweek in the City every Wednesday at 7 p.m. And then afterwards, we will do a Zoom call with your questions. And that, as always, remains an integral part of Midweek in the City. It's not just the conversation that we have here, but it's the conversation that we have with you that gives it its power. And so please stick around for half an hour or so afterwards, and we'll let you know when that Zoom call is going to begin. Megan, anything to add to that?
No, we're excited to kick off a new semester, and so hopefully we'll be back in person sometime in the near future. But for now, this is going to be our format, and so we're really excited for the lineup that we have this semester.
I do want to say that coming up in March, it's March, isn't it? We're going to have Mental Health Month. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
Mental health, mental wellness, and so stay tuned for more details on that. And we'll have some guests that will help us to talk through some of those things. But we thought it would be a really helpful conversation for us all to talk about talking to each other. And so, Wendy, thank you for being here with us this evening. I really appreciate that. Yeah. And it is you're helping us, and you haven't even said anything, and you're helping us. So thank you.
Yeah.
Silence is sometimes golden.
Absolutely.
So I met Wendy because I just really cold emailed you several months ago when I moved to San Antonio, and we met for coffee, and I just really thought she was incredible. And so she does so much work here in the San Antonio community through Interfaith San Antonio and just a lot of different things. So First of all, just to kick us off, could you tell us about your work at Interfaith, how you got involved, what that work looks like?
Well, thank you, Megan. Appreciate all those good words from both you and Brian. Interfaith San Antonio Alliance is a fairly new organization, and it was founded in 2018, mm-hmm. and I am the executive director, which may sound like, oh yes, it's large, and no, I'm a solo staff. It's just me, but there are about 60 congregations who are involved at varying levels. And the whole point is to build a network of friendship and relationship among faith leaders. Mm-hmm. And that's faith leaders from across the spectrum. And so it's a continual process of bringing people into and connecting with each other. And then the point is, then once we have relationship, it becomes all the easier to be involved in civic engagement and living out our faith, whatever that particular tradition may be. We all have some real foundational issues we agree on, and what we're doing so far is working on affordable housing as that project.
Yeah. So that's a common ground initiative that everybody can rally around there.
Right. It was a vote of the organization to say, if we're going to have a particular point of focus to start with as a civic engagement, what would it be? And that's what was agreed upon, was affordable housing.
You know, and there's much to be said for working on a common task together. It also has byproducts there. It builds trust with folks. But clearly, again, it's a byproduct. It's not the main thrust is to work for affordable housing. But do you adopt or will you adopt projects like this yearly or just periodically? How will that schedule roll out with the Interfaith San Antonio?
There's not an assigned schedule. It's more a matter of the consensus of the organization to say, okay, we've gone about as far as we can go in this direction.
Okay.
Where do we need to turn our attention next?
Okay.
And part of the conversation that we're having this morning, as far as learning more about talking to each other beyond differences, is very much of interest within the organization right now. I've had calls from some of our faith leaders saying we need to be more and more a part of this.
Okay, that's very, very interesting because there is something to be said for taking the time and expending the energy to reach beyond our own echo chambers. I mean, we do surround ourselves often with people who agree with us, and that's not just to insulate ourselves. It's just the spheres often in which we work. I mean, sometimes we do want to stay there because we are afraid, but I would guess that much of the time we stay in our own spheres because it's just our work. It's just the work that we do with like-minded folks. We build a church. We are in a congregation with folks, and we do what a local church does. But when we reach beyond that, there is an added component of lifting our eyes and looking out, and it seems like that's what Interfaith San Antonio Alliance is trying to do.
Very much so. I mean, we are privileged to have within our community, within our network, the local Archdiocese of the Catholic Church is well represented, numerous Protestant churches, the Sikh community, Muslims, and more recently Baha'i and Hindu have begun to be more a part of what we're doing.
Because
and
this is interfaith.
Right, and the Jewish community as well.
Okay. Oh, sure, absolutely. It's not just interdenominational, it is interfaith.
It is interfaith.
All these different Christian traditions, Christian and non-Christian,
right.
Across those lines. Now, there is I want to branch off here from this question that I had down here, and it's
don't throw me off.
No,
Brian.
no, it's not a curveball, but it is.
I just memorized.
It is this. We have organizations. We can have an organization like this. How does that then translate into how faith communities think about one another and interact for the common good? You can have leaders doing that. How does that translate into the faith communities doing that? How do you get that saturation there? Is that too much of a... I don't think it's a curveball, but maybe it kind of is.
Well, I think what you're saying is goals.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that we're establishing goals. And, as they say, as the head goes, so goes the body.
Sure.
And if you have leadership who is actively involved in making those kinds of connections and relationships, and most of us are in preaching traditions.
Right.
And so for me to preach and make reference to my friends within the Muslim community, my friends within the Sikh community, et cetera, then it just creates a sense of openness to, oh, maybe I need to know about those people.
Right.
Maybe I have things to learn from them. Interestingly enough, 2 years ago, my friend G.P. Singh, who is very much a leader in the Sikh community, asked me, he said, Wendy, would you get 20 Christians together to come to the Dharamsal one night and learn about Sikhism? And I went, sure, thinking, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. But why not? So I did. I found 20 Christians who said, well, that sounds very interesting. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Dharamsal. Sign me up. So we went, and many of them were Baptist, as am I. And at the end, it was the most interesting experience that some of my Baptist friends left the Dharamsal saying, well, I think I could be sick.
Oh, my word.
And then my Baptist church said, well, we want to return the favor and do a program for them about being Baptist Christians. And so we did. And at the end, GP said, I could be a Baptist. And it's those kinds of connections of simply helping people meet one another, experience one another, that opens hearts and minds. And it is really not about converting anyone other than the conversion of the heart to seeing God in all people.
Well, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about the ancient world and Christianity's place in that milieu, and you had a whole lot of people talking to one another, did you not? I mean, there were pagan traditions, there were Jewish traditions, and other mystery religions and whatever, and Christianity was a part of that, and and marginalized to boot, and it was still it still retained and increased in its robustness as well. So I think we tend to look at these things as threatening our market share, if you will, and that's really kind of that's a kind of a crass way to put that.
But all research shows diversity strengthens.
That's very, very good to hear that kind of perspective, Megan.
Well, and when a faith leader, when your own pastor can say, I know this person by name, and I know, if it's a Muslim community leaders, it takes away the fog of, them being other and them being kind of over here, this community that I can't really interact with. It takes away the fog and kind of opens up this new ability to have community. So I'm so glad that you guys, that you do that and that you have those exchanges.
Absolutely.
That's incredible. Yeah. What is something in this work, through interfaith and working in intentionally diverse groups, what is something that you've learned yourself from working in those communities?
Some of the commonalities that perhaps I knew on an intellectual level, but now have really experienced on a heart level. I'll go by way of my own experience. My mom, who was a beautifully devout Christian, hospitality was absolutely the core of her religious practice. I mean, she didn't talk about diversity. I don't know that was even a word people were throwing around back at the time, but she lived it. She absolutely lived it, whether it was the fact that she made a point to be a part of our local jail ministry. She worked with moms of color, and they developed a biracial Girl Scout troop in our neighborhood. She just did all these things. It wasn't that she took a class or was no, she just did it because Christ demanded it of her to love everybody and be a part of whatever community she was in. And so that's a big part of my background and training, if you will. So, okay, now tell me your question again.
Just things that you've learned from being in such a diverse circle. Yeah.
There you go. So I started off with a mother who modeled for me those kinds of experiences and the strengthening that came from knowing lots of different people from different experiences. So what I was saying is, by working in interfaith community, I'm learning so much of the foundational shared values, and hospitality being one of those. So yeah, that's where I was going with my mom and her hospitality.
Can I interject something here? Something that you said produced a great feeling of nostalgia in me, and that when you were talking about your mother and the way that she moved into the community, there was something that we used to know, Wendy, that we don't know anymore. It seems like to me. It seems like, you said your mother didn't have to go to a class She didn't have to complete a multiculturalism curriculum, whatever it may
Right.
be. She just did these things. Now, because Christ demanded her, yes, this was a manifestation of her faith, but faith, those tenets of faith were, many times they were present in the community. Even outside of Christianity, you would have Jews who were teaching these things to their children. You would have Christians teaching their things. You would have other Christians of all stripes, and you had that kind of diversity, but it was sort of in the air because it was commonly taught, and it seems like we've forgotten some of that, and so maybe it's these are the birth pangs or the growing pains of relearning those things. Is that fair to say? Something your mother knew, we have forgotten.
I would have to say, in my own observation, my mom was really exceptional.
Okay,
And
all
and
right.
I say that because, quite honestly, my own household was of two minds. My father was as opposite as she was.
Okay.
As opposite from her as he could have been. He was very close-minded. He was very bigoted.
Okay.
And he was an angry person.
Mm.
And that's the initial launching pad for me to say, one of these is not like the other.
Okay.
Which way do I want to go? Oh, here's a gracious, happy, joyful person. Here's an angry, bitter person.
Yes.
I'm thinking this looks pretty good over here. And that was very much a trajectory for my life. And it's that kind of unique commitment to faith, of a radical hospitality that I find over and over again in numerous faith communities.
Right.
And whether it's when I go and with the Turkish Muslims at the Raindrop Foundation,
Right.
radical hospitality. When GP calls me up and says, will you bring 20 Christians to the Dharamsal? Radical hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
No one is there to convince you that you need to do anything other than be yourself and be welcome.
Mm.
And that's the kind of radical hospitality that my mother practiced and demonstrated for me.
And in your recounting of the differences between your mother and father, I am reminded that yes, I have to be realistic about what I see in the past there, because clearly there were things in that day and time, civically and politically, that were absolutely immoral, with racial segregation
Right.
and
Yeah, I'm a child of the 60s.
attitudes.
So that
attitudes
was absolutely what was happening when I was a child.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. Attitudes that were taught and passed down. And so that is a profound, that absolutely was a profound perspective that your mother had, translating into action. At the same time, I am wondering I'm wondering where along the way, and maybe it wasn't since ancient times, that we lost the ability to speak to one another across cultural divides and across faith divides, and so forth. I don't know where we lost that.
And yet I think you make a good point. If you go back to ancient times moving forward, we have always been in this ebb and flow. You know, it's not as if it's always here or always there. We seem to always be on the spectrum somewhere.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are many, many issues, causes that have brought us to where we are right now
Right.
in American society. But I think back to what we initially were calling the culture wars,
Yes.
and that has just continued to manifest and separate us all the more.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, the Interfaith San Antonio Alliance, I understand, conducted a pre-election and post-election
That was a great
conversation.
conversation. Yeah, that
And
was
were,
fun.
were you a part of that?
Yeah, so I was there for some, which Wendy's been so gracious to let me into the fold of interfaith and
Yeah,
kind of
that's
include me
fascinating.
on these conversations. And I was only there for some of both of those conversations, but it was encouraging to me to even see people that were willing to talk about, okay, what would it look like to and that week was just, and that was a couple weeks before the election. And then
Well,
and
we
then-
did actually.
Right.
We did the first one on election eve,
Right, it was election eve.
and then 2 weeks later we did the post-election
Yeah.
conversation.
And
So how did talk about that a little bit? How did that go?
Well, first of all, it's helpful to know that it was a collaborative effort.
Okay.
It wasn't just Interfaith San Antonio Alliance. We had interest within our board to do something, like
Yeah,
everybody's on pins and needles and we need to do something.
sure.
And then Ann Helmke, who is the faith liaison for the city of San Antonio, Ann was talking about doing this pre and post. And I was like, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's join forces. And so she welcomed us to work with her and the Peace Center on this project.
Excellent.
And so it was a Zoom, initially, I think there were about 90-something people who registered to come and participate. And we had a panel. We had a panel that we had carefully curated, and we didn't identify them as being of a particular party or a particular persuasion, whatever, but we intentionally put our panel together with those kinds of criteria in mind of racial diversity, political diversity, et cetera. Gender diversity, religious diversity, all
Sure,
those things.
sure.
In putting the panel together so that we knew as the curators of this event that we were getting a mix of opinion. And yet we were also committed to making sure it was people of compassion who would be on the panel. We weren't looking for outliers to
Sure.
stir things up.
Right,
We
right.
simply wanted people who represented most of us who are of a wide range of perspective, but share the desire for the best for our community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay, there's many more. I mean, how did you go about finding
We can
those
have
folks?
lunch sometime,
I mean,
Brian.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, really, I mean, that's great because
Yeah.
sometimes.
And we want to continue that into this coming year.
Well, see, when organizations look for folks to have a conversation, often, and I'm thinking really in media, anywhere on the spectrum, far left, far right, they'll get the most firebrand
Right.
people they can get. So the fact that you got a larger swath through the middle of people is
Yeah,
fascinating.
it was
to
a
me.
6-member panel.
Okay. Wow.
And then we would ask questions of the panel, and they would have a nice discussion or have a discussion about whatever the question was. And then we would send them off into the little Zoom world
Oh,
where they
yeah,
would
the
be in
little
small
breakout.
groups, and you would wind up in a group with people you may or may not know anything about and discuss the same question.
Yeah.
And that's what I've noticed. Y'all did that, and then I know you've had some conversations around the vaccine, and it seems that the work that y'all do really, like we said earlier, just kind of aims to take away the fog and just kind of allow conversation to happen a little more freely, in a positive way, in a constructive way, which I appreciate, because I think there's, we're having the conversation no matter what, but is it in a constructive way? Is it in a circle where, it's homogenous, but y'all have had these conversations with diversity in mind and with unity in mind. And so it's been encouraging to me to watch y'all operate, and as obstacles keep coming,
Oh, this is very encouraging. Thank you, Megan.
Wow.
And we know that I think maybe I thought it was 2 weeks before the election because the election week was so long, but, and we know, the chaos or the disunity and the strife has not ended. It didn't end with election week. Just a few days ago, we had a really rough day in DC, and then when our single adults watch this, it'll be on Inauguration Day, actually.
Okay.
And so moving forward, and with all of those things in mind, how can we continue to have these conversations about unity? What have you learned from the pre and post election conversation? How can we move forward in have those conversations together.
Well, I go back to kind of where I was headed a minute ago, talking about hospitality and what do we have in common. And when we're talking about people of faith, regardless of the faith tradition, typically, there are some outlier exceptions, but in general, certainly the major world religions, we have the commonality of hospitality as a hallmark that as a person of faith you extend to other people. And it's rooted in the ethic of reciprocity, which we also know as the golden rule.
Yeah.
Treat others as you want to be treated. And so I think it's a really golden spot to begin when it comes to starting a conversation. Instead of jumping into the differences, let's start the conversation with the ground rules of what we share in common.
Yeah.
And I find that to take a lot of the sting out of a conversation, because it is very, very important to me personally, and certainly within our organization, to recognize that we are all made as creations of God in the image of God. That's an important starting point.
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, we owe each other the respect and honor that comes with the very fact that we are children of God.
Yeah.
If we don't start there,
Imagine that.
well, sadly,
if?
we don't have to imagine. But I'm wondering if, it just sounds almost too rudimentary for you to say that, and yet it's profound at the same time, because this ethic of reciprocity, the golden rule, if you don't start there, maybe that makes any other kind of substantial conversation that involves differing perspectives impossible. I don't know. I'm just putting that out
I think
there.
you make a good point, that it's very hard for me to hear you if you don't agree with me.
Right.
Yeah, if you don't agree with me, it's hard for me to hear you if all I can think about is how wrong you are
That's right.
and how right I am.
And so if there is this foundation of mutual regard.
And mutual is very important, right? It is a
Absolutely.
matter of kind of setting the ground rules. For us to have this conversation, we're going to need to agree to this ethic of reciprocity.
Yeah.
Because if only one side's offering that, it becomes a very imbalanced conversation in a hurry.
Exactly. And there are ways to offer a fake version of that too.
Sure.
And it is, but it's clearly, people pick up on that immediately, and so you can know pretty well right off the bat when somebody is truly welcoming you.
Oh, yeah.
I think.
Oh, definitely. Genuine hospitality makes you feel so warm, so present. And when it's just kind of surface, like you said, you know it immediately.
So hitting that golden rule note, that is maybe before we can, now I'm just sort of spitballing here, but maybe before we can move on beyond to anything else, we just have to go there ad nauseum. Just really double down on that over and over until people are sick of the golden rule. No, I don't. But really, how much is too much of that? Because we are building, we hope, a way for us to have some kind of life together, which involves differing perspectives. It's got to, but you can't do that unless you hold each other in high regard.
Yeah, it's so true. When I think about what's happening in our country and just how shrill things are.
Shrill is a good word. Yeah.
Yeah. there is not a regard for what the other perspective is, regardless, when you're talking about those shrill voices.
That's right.
And when, regardless of the religious tradition, but when your political persuasions, whatever that might mean,
Right.
are louder and better known than the tenets of your faith, you've gotten out of balance.
That's a sad statement of what we are facing right now. I mean, often we'll say, oh, that person is a conservative, or that person is a liberal,
Fill
or
in the
whatever
blank.
it may be.
Fill in the blank.
And that's how that person is known. What?
Yeah.
Right. That it's just so easy to label and discount. And
that labeling is one way of discounting, isn't it? I mean, in and of itself.
sure. But we go back to kind of the early part of this conversation with the idea that, okay, we tend as people to be tribal.
Right.
It's kind of in the DNA that you hang with the people who are like you.
Right.
And everybody does it, and yet, studies show diversity enriches and strengthens and all these good things. Well, yeah, all these pieces fit together, don't they? There's that sense of, okay, labeling is just shorthand.
Right.
I could go, okay, don't need to deal with you. Don't need to deal with you.
Yeah. It's a sorting mechanism,
Yeah,
really.
it is. And so the hard work of faith is the golden rule.
That's very succinctly and profoundly put. The hard work of faith is the golden rule.
Yeah.
Because Jesus calls us to transcend, to do the hard work of transcending those sorting mechanisms, I guess.
Right. So back to Megan's question about what have I learned? That's what I've learned. The hard work of faith is the golden rule.
Yeah.
Man.
And that's what I've...
Mark that down, everybody.
And that really goes, we as a church are studying the book of Mark right now. And I think the last few weeks it's just unfolded how Mark is really kind of laying the kingdom of God out before you, right? And he's saying, here, this is what it looks like. Here are the politics of the kingdom of God. Here's what it looks like. And I think in recent weeks, and this, what you've just said has brought this back up to me, the hospitality is a gift of the Spirit, right? It is not something that, I'm naturally always going to have in me. That is something that I get when I press into the Spirit of God, right? And I think I forget that. And I think I forget to ask the Lord for that. There's still things in me that need to be worked out. And hospitality and this golden rule, that's not part of the politic of this world. It's part of the politic of the kingdom of God, right? And so I think there's more work to be done personally for me to search after that. And I forget that.
Yeah. And there really is so much value for me, and I'm going to place it on all of you to get out of your silo. It's not to say, oh, your silo's bad.
Yeah.
But just to live in a silo is so limiting and becomes a ready echo chamber.
Yeah.
And for my household, when we moved from Kentucky to San Antonio in 2017, that was a big piece of our motivation to move here. Because we lived in a little college town, and once you got about 2 feet off the college campus, everybody looked pretty much alike and went to the same places and worshiped alike. And it was like, wow, there's got to be more. And so coming to San Antonio, I just literally, even before I started working with Interfaith San Antonio Alliance, I just looked for places to be, to meet and connect and know people who didn't look or sound like me.
Yeah.
And it was one of the most gratifying things I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of stories about that. But, for instance, Dream Week is just an amazing opportunity here in San Antonio. Just you can go online and there's just opportunities. Now, I realize pandemic, things are going to be different.
That's happening now, isn't it? Or about to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's January. And just that's one of those opportunities that I recommend to people. Go look at those lists. Just find something that intrigues you and show up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when does the call for unity, or how do we keep the call for unity from papering over the hurt that people feel? How do we do the work of unity without ignoring or turning away from or minimizing hurt that people feel
Yeah.
really right now? I got a call yesterday from an individual who wants to talk through the events of recent days and recent weeks, really. And there's some hurt. There's a whole lot of hurt radiating there. So how do we do both of those things? Address hurt and call for unity.
Well, and I think you put it in exactly the right order.
Okay.
Yeah.
You listen deeply and walk with that person in the hurt. But regardless of what the source of the hurt, that's typically our goal, right? Is to walk through that valley and help folks come to the other side of the valley.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 I know that's what recently, and really not necessarily recently, but the church often is tempted to, the church in general is tempted to, say a prayer and call for unity and kind of move the ball along and not really sit with people in the hurt, or, because it's going to cause some fracture, or because it's going to kind of lift the veil off of some things that have really been there for a long time.
Yes.
And it's a delicate process, right? It's a delicate thing to ask people to be unified, but also to acknowledge and hold people accountable, right, for their actions and for the way that they move in the world. And so I think you're right. I think doing it in that order, if we're going to support the hurting, then we have to do it in that order. But
right.
But
and
that's difficult. Yeah.
It's a reasonable question in the process of listening to help people examine where that hurt comes from. And likewise, potentially, to look at other sources of hurt for other individuals, organizations, groups of people, races, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
there's plenty of hurt to go around.
And some we may not be aware of. Probably aren't. Most probably aren't.
Yeah.
So,
what does this look like for leaders? I know you're in a leadership role at your faith community, and what does it look like for leaders to kind of discharge this this hospitality and this unity and these things that we're talking about? What does that look like for a community leader?
Honesty.
Yeah.
Like you said, not glossing over and pretending we're all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya now.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we are in a world of hurt.
See, I when you say that, I think about somebody saying, okay, we've gotten through these last few weeks. Let's look forward. And some people say, well, I'm still getting through. I haven't gotten through anything.
Yeah.
And so honesty, that's a big word.
Yeah, I think that's one of those terms that, again, can be overused and to the point of being disingenuous. But the reality is, just like you said a minute ago, we all pick up on it if people aren't genuine, if it's just the gloss for the sake of the gloss.
Yeah.
And so whether it's in leadership, in doing conversations where, again, set the ground rules and then let people express what they need to express with that higher purpose in mind. That sense of who are we called to be as people of faith?
Yeah.
And sometimes to get there, you got to get through the ugly. You got to face your own demons to get to the other side.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've, I think, with the single adults, in some ways have kind of wrestled with this last semester. We ended up having a service of lament together because there's been this, like, there's so much yuck and so much that's happened last year. Thankfully, we can say last year now that there was just so much to deal with that we ended up just having a time of lament together, of corporate lament. And I think that for me has opened up a lot of thoughts about how to make that a long-term spiritual practice for
And by
my
the
own
way,
life.
that was in the Advent season.
Right.
And so it was, Advent in that instance became more than just a calendar marker. It was actually a put to use.
And I think that's part of what you're talking about too. We could lament together and not just try to move along, but really sit with each other in corporate lament, and have a healing time. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and to call for that. I really commend you in that you called for a time of lament.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, way to go. That was
No,
awesome.
that's the single adults thing.
Truly. And speaking of that, I another, and that was a leadership, the calling for that was a leadership act. And then, Wendy, as you were talking about honesty, I was listening to you, but you started some things turning in my mind here, and that was the use of imagination. I wonder if leaders in the places that they stand, especially in preaching or teaching or calling people together, if it would be good to spend some time weighing the comments that the leader is considering making, and then saying, okay, if I were a part of this group, what would my questions be? Just imagining, if I were a part of this other group, what would my questions or my thoughts be right now? And we may not always know that, but at least, and there are other ways to find that out. You could ask people, but in addition, the existence of imagination could serve us well here, I think. What do we think people in this group what would be top of mind? And then saying those things in a kind of an act of empathy there. Some of you may be saying this. Some of you may be thinking that. If we spend time, I think sometimes leaders just get up and in a public gathering, and the temptation sometimes is just to say something that sounds leadery, but to spend time with that kind of imagination beforehand. Anyway, that's what you prompted in my thinking there when you were talking about the honesty.
And I greatly appreciate that idea, that use of creativity and imagination. And I would add to that reading. I mean, there are so many resources, books, articles, online if where people share their experiences, who share what their feelings are and why.
Yes.
And, if you're having a struggle to make those personal connections with people who don't think, look, act like you.
Right.
Well, read what other people have to say about their own experience.
Well, and when people hear a leader saying those kinds of things, either they will go, that's what I am feeling, in which case it's an empathetic kind of dynamic there, or they might say, I've never thought about that. Or they could just not listen, but if they listen, maybe it pricks their hearts in a new way, or it results in somebody saying, oh, somebody's voicing what I'm feeling.
And it can be helpful, a helpful discipline, to not only read from another perspective, but to journal as you're reading.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, because you may read things, you're like, well, that's just not right. Well,
Right.
that can't be true. Well,
Put that
you don't
down.
have you don't have the
here's-
author there in front of you,
Right.
So have that dialogue on paper.
Right. Write that down and say, here was my first response. Now let me
Yeah.
respond to that response. And you know, so okay, that's good. Wow, you're prompting all kinds. kinds
I know,
of
I have no
stuff
idea
here.
how much time we have left. But
Okay, now what's most important for a church, for a congregation to hear, Wendy, during these times? You think?
I think it's really important. I mean, we've touched on many things,
Sure.
but I do think it's really important to be reminded of what is the basis of our faith. And for Christians, what is it that Jesus teaches?
Yeah.
You know, you talk about nonviolence. Well, Jesus was really
Yeah.
good at that.
Yeah.
The whole gospel there, not
Yeah.
just how to get to heaven or how
Right.
to
What did
ask
he
for
teach us
forgiveness of
about
sin
how
or
to
whatever.
live?
How to live, not just how to die. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big part of what we need to be reminded of, and echoes back what I was saying a little while ago, that when any group of faithful people become more known for their political views than their faith,
Yeah.
something's out of balance. I mean, you know, I will use an example. When 9/11 happened, you know, when there was the tragedy, the horror of that terrorism, thousands of Muslims were just painted with this broad brush
Yeah.
that they all fit this terrorist category.
That's right.
Well, that wasn't remotely true.
Yeah.
And so thousands of Muslims really got active in making sure that their communities knew, we are here as servants of God. We are here to help and to create space and to serve the poor. And that's what I think has to happen when these broad brushstrokes come with any particular group, then it's incumbent on all the rest of the group to overcome that.
Boy, and I'm remembering now that you're saying this, these we painted with these broad brushstrokes. Here's who the Muslim is, and
Whether or
then-
not we'd ever met one.
exactly. And then we went to the Muslim and said, "Do you denounce these attacks?" After having painted them, so here they are wounded by words, and then we say, "Are you going to say words that we approve of when we ask you this question?"
Yeah,
That's a very hostile
loaded.
posture to take with people, and violent even, to condemn a person or to consign a person to certain unapproved ways of living, to ascribe to that person impure motives, whatever, and then to come along and say, "Will you say what I want you to say?"
right. Yeah. You're going to have to fit my script
Exactly.
to be okay.
And then we are shocked and surprised that the first words out of somebody's mouth is not to condemn violence in the way that we think they ought to condemn it, but to say, "Wait a minute, we're not this,
Yeah.
we're not who you say we are,
Right.
you know. Well, do you condemn this or not? And it becomes this fruitless exercise in bias confirmation, I think.
As opposed to hearing their story
Right.
and what, so I think maybe a better question would be, how did that feel to you when that happened?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's, yes.
As opposed to just approaching anyone with the prejudgment of, I already know what your answer is.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
See, folks, told you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
kind of disgusting, but
Golden rule.
golden rule. golden rule.
Well, and what have you learned about God or the character of God through working with people of other faiths?
Oh, God is everywhere.
Yeah.
My missions professor, when I was in seminary, Dr. Bryant Hicks, I've never forgotten his words. God's truth is, all truth is God's truth no matter where you find it.
Mm-hmm.
All truth is God's truth no matter where you find it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have certainly been blessed to see that over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That none of us have a corner on the market.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean I have to give up anything about my relationship to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's one of the beauties of working in the organization I do, as my friend Reverend Mignon Jones Spann of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. She's on our board. And Mignon has said before, you know, we all come together respecting each other's traditions. No one is needing to make a change of what their faith perspective is to be a part of who we are.
Yeah.
And that gets misunderstood sometimes in some circles, that to participate in an interfaith organization,
Right.
that you've got to give up.
Right.
No, that's not the
Which
point.
then
Right.
really translates in a lot of people's minds to what you're saying is it doesn't matter what you believe. Well, that's the furthest thing from the truth.
No.
That's not at all what people who gather together from across a diverse set of beliefs are trying to do. They're not
Right.
trying to say.
And there are organizations that's,
Of course.
you know, I mean, yeah, that's who they are.
Yes.
And they're public about that. But an interfaith organization such as ours is all about, you are a faith leader from a specific tradition, come and be with us and we'll learn together.
I think that is.
But again, these are all prominent faith leaders, so they're not going to join an organization to give up.
Join
Yeah.
an organization.
They're not gonna say it doesn't
make
matter.
sense. Right.
Join
exactly.
it and disavow,
Yeah.
what you believe.
Yeah, you know,
is-
nobody's going to try to whitewash
exactly.
their religious tradition just to be a part of this group. I mean,
and that
that's
can't
antithetical.
it can't be said enough, really, because we are coming together because we do know that what we believe really does matter, and if it does matter, then we've got to, as finite people, we've got to understand that we sharpen one another,
Right.
we can learn from one another, and we can hear from God all the better, I think.
Well, kind of a fun little story along those lines. So I was speaking to a rabbi recently, and he was telling me how he was recounting a conversation with an evangelical friend from earlier in his life. And he said, so we were talking, and my friend says, so Steve, what if Jesus returns and sure enough he is the Messiah? What are you going to do? And Rabbi Steve says, well, I'm going to rejoice, and I'm going to say, this is great news. Look, the Messiah has come. And then Steve said, but then I said to him in response, so, but have you thought about what if the Messiah shows up and he goes, Jesus who? What are you going to do? He's like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And that's,
Yeah,
at least be open to the fact not everybody sees things the way you do.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. I think that it is a very encouraging and heartening thing that y'all are doing as the Interfaith San Antonio Alliance, because it has these seeds of hope for a world that could be.
And that really is the mission of our organization and those who are kindred organizations that are developing across the country.
Well, Wendy, we have to figure out a way to live with one another. We have to. We have
To survive.
to survive.
Yeah.
And then certainly to thrive.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Is there anything, and we've asked all of our guests this last semester, I think because I need ideas, but what has brought you peace or joy during these months of the pandemic and these difficult times that we've been in?
People.
Yeah.
I am a people person, through and through. And the more isolated I am, the more sad I am.
Yeah.
So as much as I don't enjoy Zoom, I'm grateful for Zoom because, with all of the necessity of staying home and staying away from people, etc. I mean, I was grateful when I met you, and you're like, I'd be happy to meet at an outdoor coffee shop.
I was on a
Me
high all
too.
day. I was like, I had coffee with somebody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we are blessed that we live in a city of patios.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's for sure.
so that's a big help. But people always give me energy and bless me, whether it's a meaningful and rich conversation or just talking about whatever's latest thing on Netflix.
Yeah.
Just saying.
That's our next episode,
Right.
by the way.
But, because again, I have such a high value of God in every person, or I try to, I should say.
Yeah.
That's my goal. And so I experience the divine by being in relationship with people.
Yeah.
So that's what brings me joy.
Yeah. That's encouraging.
That is encouraging.
Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. This was a great way to kick off this semester for Midweek in the City, and I know it's going to be an encouraging word.
Absolutely.
Especially on Inauguration Day, which just kind of worked out that way. But we're grateful for your time with us.
Well, I am greatly honored, and thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, Wendy.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. Everybody, we're going to have a conversation now on Zoom. So click that link and head on over there.
Yeah.
And
We'll see you there.
join the conversation.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.